Yes, Sundaram. So we are live. We can start.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from the respective places you are watching it now. Hope you are safe there, and thanks for showing interest to learn on this amazing weekend. Before getting into the session, I would like to share a very happy news that the ng-Keralam is getting into its first year. That is, last year by this time we started this community, and now I would like to thank each and every one of us for giving a tremendous support, and also to our speakers. Many of you may know ng-Keralam is a community based on Angular stock. We used to organize events on fourth Saturday of every month. ng-Keralam comes under a community called Talkify. Talkify is mainly focused on Microsoft stack, and we used to organize events on every second Saturday. And today we are much excited to host our 12th episode of ng-Keralam. In this event, we are going to explore Angular component design patterns and building real-time Angular apps using NgRx and Websockets. So we have two amazing speakers, Bharath Ravi and Jay. Without much delay, let's get into the session. Over to you, Bharath.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Sundaram, for that wonderful intro. Let me start sharing my screen.
Sure.
Great. I hope I'm sharing my screen now and everyone can see. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Everybody is watching. Thank you for joining with me on this Saturday evening. So today we are going to discuss about component design patterns in Angular. The target audience of this discussion would be junior to intermediate Angular developers. If you are if you are an experienced Angular developer, you might find most of the topics we are discussing familiar, right? Let's jump into it. Right. We are going to discuss about component design patterns in Angular. So I can imagine that the title sounds a little difficult and sounds a little complicated, but we are simply going to create a drawer component, taking it from the basic version of it, making it better version by version, and by end of our versions, which is V5, we will have a pretty reusable, efficient component. Great. Before we jump into it, let me introduce myself. My name is Bharat. I have been working on Angular for the last 2 to 3 years. Currently, I'm working at a company called StoreDraft, where we are building a legal tech product for contract management end-to-end solution. Right. So, like I said, we will be taking the example of a drawer component. A drawer component can be as simple as a sidebar component. So in your dashboard, you will always, all of your dashboards, you will have this sidebar component, which may be opening from the left or the right, and bringing some data into the view and closing it when it is not needed, right? So that is basically our drawer component. And we will be creating version 1 of it, and we'll be taking it through versions till version 6. Actually, we'll be taking it till version 5, and I'll give you a hint about the version 6 as well. And each of the version will be making the component better and better. That's the plan for the day. So for a quick sneak peek into what we are going to do, let me go to Medium. This is a Medium, one of my article, and you can see there is a response button over here. And if you open, you get to see the responses through a sidebar or a drawer. So this is basically what we will be implementing today. I hope everyone have a fair idea of what we are going to do and how we are going to do it. So let's not waste our time. Let's jump into it. Great. So the first initial version, which is a V1. In fact, I already have the V1 written, and this will be a very basic version where if you are, let's say if you are an Angular developer who's starting and who knows about the components and how Angular application works, and At that point, if you are to do a component like this, that would, let's say that would be the version v1, right? This is a simple wireframe that I came up with. Let's say we have this is what we'll be implementing, right? So let's say we have a dashboard component, and then we have a common drawer component, just like what the medium had, right? So we have a common component, and this component will be opened from the dashboard by clicking a button somewhere in the dashboard, and we should be able to get this opened with some little bit of animation, and we should be able to close this by clicking a close button right here, right? So this is our idea for the version 1. Let me actually take you to the code. So in fact, if you're following along, you can go to my GitHub repository, github.com/Bharath Ravi 27 ng-Keralam demo, and you will find a branch named v1, and that's where I'm starting with. It has a little bit of styling and the basic v1 that we wanted to implement already. So if you are feeling like following along, please, you can clone this repo, right? So here is the repo. I hope my code is visible.
Yes, Bharath.
Yeah, thank you. So this is pretty basic. I just created a fresh new Angular repo, added a couple of styles, and actually created a couple of components. There is a dashboard component, and then there is a drawer v1 component, which I already have over here, right? Then on the styles.css, I have added a couple of global styles. I'm simply styling the button, and I am giving basic style for the HTML and the body. We will come back to this later, right? Let that live there for now. So let's see how this application looks like at this point, right? I hope this application is running. Yeah, great. Let's go back and see how it looks at this point. So we have a button which says open drawer, and if you click on this, we get the drawer open from the right, and there's a close button over here by which we can close the drawer. So this v1 is already implemented. I'll walk you through the code right after this. So you see there is a content inside this, and we can close this and we can open this. Pretty basic, nothing great, right? So how did we implement v1? Let me first go to app component. App component simply has the dashboard component. So let me explain the dashboard component, where we have app version 1 and a button. So this button is how we are opening and closing the drawer, and app v1 is how the drawer is working, right? Let me now go to v1, which is simply a component with a little bit of content and a button to close the drawer and a little bit of style. We have used a little bit of style binding to say open and close the drawer, right? Hold on, I know you might have a little bit of doubts, right? Hold on. So how are we opening and closing the drawer? Let me go back to the controller. Let me show you what all inputs and outputs this component has, right? So we have one input, which is deciding if this drawer is open or closed at this point of time, because we want to be able to open and close this drawer from outside. So input is a method. Input is a class Angular provides from the core, by which you can pass data from the parent to the child, right? And then we also have an event, which is an output. Output is basically another class Angular provides, by which you can communicate from the child to the parent, right? So we have an input which determines whether at this point the drawer is open or not, and then we have an output which tells the parent whenever you close the drawer, right? Whenever you click on the X button on the drawer, right? And what we are basically doing is, so you see the drawer container class over here, and if you can go to the style.css, you'll see it has been positioned absolutely on the top right with a width of 400 pixels and given a little bit of transition, right, for the animation. So in fact, this drawer at this point is actually placed over here, which you can't see because it's out of the window. So it's placed over here, and when you click on this button, we are making the input is open true, which changes this time by. It makes the write from 0 to from minus 400 pixel to 0, right? So this is how currently our drawer component working. Pretty basic. This is the classic way of making a sidebar component, right? We keep it out of the view and bring it into the view whenever we need it. Pretty classic way of doing it. So you might think, okay, so we already have a working solution. Why do we even need to go for another V2 or the version 2? Why do we even need to make another version out of it? It already seems like what we need, right? Correct. So let's take this hypothetical scenario of you needing the same kind of functionality outside of the same application, but in some other places, right? Let's say you have a settings drawer where you click on some button and a drawer with settings coming from the right to the view or maybe left to the view. How could you do that? So how would you go about creating such a component at this point, right? So what you will have to do, you'll have to create another component, maybe call it the settings drawer component and copy everything over here, paste everything over there, and then you might have to replace this content, which basically replaces your settings template, right? And whatever the controller that settings that you need, you'll have to change. So basically you will have to copy everything from here and place it over there, even if you're doing the same exact thing in both the components. So what do we have common in these both, right? In settings drawer and the V1 drawer, the common drawer, right? We have drawer common. So why don't we extract into a separate component and then use the same component to host settings and the comment, right? So we at least at this point, we know that we have a difficulty, we have a inconvenience of copying and pasting code over and over again, the same code over and over again. And that's why we have version 2. Before going to version 2, let's recap what we learned in the version 1, right? So we created a simple dashboard component and we created a common drawer component, and then we use the write property to open and close the drawer. As simple as that. Great. Now let's go to V2. Let's take it to the next level. Like I said, the idea here is going to be that we are going to extract our drawer component into a separate component, and then we are going to host our common component inside it. For clarity, this is the wireframe I came up with. So as you can see, now the component is named as a drawer component and common component. So it seems like it's a generic name, that it is a drawer. It can be used with anything else. So it is a generic drawer component. And inside that, we are going to host our common component, right? I think this image should be giving you a better idea of what we are doing in version 2. Great. So let's leave whatever we have right here, right? And let me create another component. So we need two components here. We need the drawer component and we need the common component, right? So let's start by creating those components. So let me create ng-gc drawer component, and I'm skipping test because we will not be getting into test, at least in this session. So yep, we have a drawer component which is created inside the drawer folder. So it is drawer/drawer component. Yeah, this wouldn't be the right way of putting them, but for the convenience of the video, I'm going to do this. And we also need common component, right? So let me create common component. Great. So we have drawer component and common component created. First thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to go here and I'm going to remove these two because we don't want version 1 anymore, but we want instead, what do we need? We need the common component, which is app comment, right? So if I go to common component, the selector is app comment, right? Let's save this. Let's go back to the application. Right, clean slate. We only have comment verbs, which is actually coming from this template, if you're wondering. Great. So let's take a step back and think what we need to implement here, right? we basically want to have the same exact functionality that we did for the version 1, right? So let me start by thinking, what do I need to take inputs and outputs of this particular component, right? So we need to be able to know when this component is open and when this component is closed, of which the decision should be taken outside this component. So we need to have an input for the if to determine whether the drawer is open or not. So set, we need one input, which is let me call it is open, and by default is false. By default, the drawer is closed. And what all can we configure is the next thought, right? Whenever you create a reusable component, this should be the thought process, at least from my point of view, right? So you should be able to see how many things that you can configure, how many things that you should let the consumer of this component to customize. So in my point of view, making the width dynamic from the outside makes a lot of sense. So let me give width also as an input and let me default it to 400. And also maybe at some point you want to have the same drawer. At this point it used to open from the right to left, right? What if you wanted the same component to open from left to right? So maybe we need to take an input which configures that as well, right? So let me call it position, and it could be right or could be left. You could create an enum to do this, but for now, let me do this. Yep. So we have three inputs. These are the things that we let the consumer control. And we also need to tell the parent when we close this component, right? So let me create an output, just like we had an output which says, maybe let's call it drawer closed and equate it to new event emitter. Okay, that was imported from the wrong place. Let's import this from the right place, Angular core, right? And we at least one function that we need that we definitely know of is a close function, right? Which tells the parent that this particular drawer is closed. So let me write that as well. Which does this drawer? What did I call it? Drawer closed dot emit. So this function emits the drawer closed event to the parent. Great. So our controller is, I think, pretty much fine. So let's go to the template file. If you're wondering how I'm switching from controller to template as quick as this, you can always check out one of the plugin VS Code, which is called ng-Switch, which I've created just for this, just to switch between the controller and the template, right? Great. So we are in the template file. So what do we need in the template? Okay, we need a wrapper. Let's bring the wrapper, which is the drawer container. If you remember, we already styled this container, right? We already have styling for this, right? And to the minimum, we need to have a button over here, right? Which basically closes this drawer, right? So on click of this button, on click of this button, we need to call the close method, which basically closes this, right? We are actually not managing state inside the drawer. We are managing the state outside. That's why we are not making isopen false in this close method, but instead emitting this event and making isopen false on the parent. So in a larger application, your requirement would be to maybe sync with a state or maybe update a subject or something like that. But at this point, let me simply manage my state this way for the easier implementation, right? Great. So, and yeah, let's save this and see what we have, right? Okay, at this point, we wouldn't have anything, by the way, because the common component, right? So we also need a button to open this component, right? We have given the close button, but we haven't given the open button, which we need to give, correct? So I am, oh, let me take, I'm sorry if I'm confusing you. Let me take all of this from, I have written all of this code in common component, but actually we want this in the drawer component, right? So I'm so sorry if, I apologize if you were misleaded. So let me take all of this code from here. Sorry about that confusion. And let me put everything in the drawer component. Let me import, input from Angular core, output from Angular core, event emitter from Angular core. So the drawer component looks fine, and yeah, that they're complaining because we don't have the ng on it. We can actually remove it, but I decided to keep it. Cool. So if you now go back to the common component, so the drawer component is ready. We have the close button. We only have the close button actually, but let's come to that later. And let me use the drawer component in the common component, right? So it's named as app drawer. So let me use it as app drawer. And if you remember, we have an input named is open. So is open, which is equal to, I am creating a local property called drawer open. Yeah. And if you remember, we have a couple more inputs, which is the width and the position, but I'll for now leave it as it is. So we'll take the default values, but we'll only control the is open property, right? So we have to have is open property on the comment, which by default is going to be false, right? And we can listen to the event, which if you remember is drawer closed. And what you can do is you can make the local property drawer open to false, right? Great. Now we have the drawer in the common component, and the common component is already in the dashboard, right? But we are missing something, right? We have to open the drawer. There's no way opening the drawer at this point, right? So let's write a button which open comments, or maybe just comments. And when you click on this, you can simply make drawer open to true, which will bring the drawer, right? So let's save this. Let's go back to our component and reload it. Great. So we have this open by default. That's weird. Let's see why. So drawer open is input is open, and by default is false. When you click on this, it is true. If you go back to the drawer, you take the input. Correct. What happened now? We think we have everything. No, we don't, because we haven't even implemented the logic to open and close the drawer, right? We have this, but we have the is open available here, but we haven't even used it, right? So if you remember, we used to do, in the previous example, we used to do style binding to do this, but here we need to have more control over it, right? Because there is position involved and then there is width involved. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take the help of ng-style, right? And instead of using an object here, I'm going to bind it to a getter, right? Drawer styles. I'm going to call it drawer styles. So we have a getter called named ng-styles. So let's think for a second what this getter is going to return, right? So the getter is solely responsible to open and close the drawer from either side, from left or right, with the specific width, right? So let me write, okay, so we obviously have to pass the width, right? Let me write it in comments. So we have to pass the width, one property, and then we have to pass the left property, or the right property, depending on whether it is the left side, whether it is opening from the left side or the right side. So if the drawer is opening from the left side, we should be passing width and left property. If the drawer is opening from the right side, we should be giving width and the right property, right? So width is common, right? So let me create that into a, so let me call it default styles, which is equal to width, which is always going to be this dot width. Sorry, which is always, let me use it literal. It's always going to be this dot width in pixels, right? This is going to be the common. And depending on whether the position is left or right, we have to decide whether to pass the left property or the right property. Let me write an if condition. If this dot position is equal to, let's say, right, then we need to return the object where we always have to return the default style. So let me do that. Let me use a spread operator to do that. We always have to return the diff. I spelled it wrong. Sorry about that. So we should always return the default styles. And if this is positioned right, we should return the right property. What should be the right? What should be the value for the right property, right? So if you think about it, if the drawer is open, we need the right property at the 0, right? And if the drawer is closed, we need to go to minus 400 pixels or minus width of the drawer, correct? So we can make that call over here. So I use this dot is open. If it is open, it's going to be at 0. Otherwise, it's going to be at -1 into -1, if I can type it right, -1 into this dot width, right, in pixels. So this is going to look something like, let me give you a comment, and this is going to look something like width is 400 pixels and right, if it is open, it's going to be 0, and if it is not open, it's going to be -400, right? Make sense? Great. So this is the case if it is opening from the right, and let me write the else case, which is open from the left. Right? If, sorry, let me delete that. Let me copy this and let me go to the else condition and let me return this. Let me return, instead of right, now we need to change the left CSS property, right? Let's save this and see if it works right. So let me just make sure that we have used the drawer styles. Yes, we have. Let me close this. Let me go back and let's try to open. Yay, it works. It works great. So we know that it opens from the right. So let's go back and let's see if it is opening from the left, right? So we know if you want to make it open from the left, we can simply pass a position, a property, an input called position, which will make it as left, right? Let me save it. Let me go back. Great. It opens from the left. There's a style issue. Let's fix that later. But great, it opens from the left. Let's remove this. And yeah, so we have a drawer that is now opening from either side of the view that we need. Also, let's try to give the width property as well, right? Let's also try that. So let me make the width, I don't know, 200 maybe. Yeah, 200 should do it. And let's see if that is working. Now we should get a smaller drawer. Exactly, we are getting a less width drawer. Great, so this works. But the only problem here is that now we don't have any content inside the drawer, right? We have the drawer, right? But we don't have any content inside this. This is where I want to introduce you to a topic called content projection. This is pretty basic Angular, you might be already knowing. So we'll use content projection to project the content from the parent to the reusable component. So basically what we need to do, what we need to have is to have whatever, right? Whatever is coming from the parent, we need to be showing here. That's all we need to do. So I'm going to write this magical string of ng content. Let's get rid of the select. So I have written ng content here. What does ng content does? Ng content grabs anything in between the opening and the closing tag and puts it over wherever you write ng content, right? That might be confusing. I'll show you how. So we have written ng content here, and now let's go back to the common component and let's start writing some lorem ipsum text over here, right? Let's save it. So between the opening and closing tags of the app drawer, I have written a lorem ipsum text, right? Let's go back and see how it works. Wow. So those content, whatever we passed between these tags are now visible inside the drawer. Isn't that great? Great. So let me actually go back to version 1 and grab exact content that we had, right? Because we need to have the common inside this and not the lorem ipsum text. So let me get rid of the lorem ipsum text and let me paste, maybe call this head and save it. These classes are doing nothing at this point. It's just there just to tell you that this is the head and this is the body. Okay, let's try to reload. Great, we have the response. We have the dropper opening and closing with our content that we need. Great. Let me actually, one last thing, get rid of the width because at least we need 400 to see the changes happening, right? Great. So this is all that is going to be in our version 2. So I hope you all have a fair idea of why we changed it and how we changed it. And maybe you are thinking, okay, we can make this better. And exactly that's what we're going to do, right? We are going to make this even better. If I can go back to the slides, let's recap what we did in the version 2. So we extracted the drawer component into a reusable separate component. And then we created a common drawer component or a common component and used it as a child of the drawer component. Use the content as a child of the drawer component and used it in the common component. Now, using the content projection, we injected our dynamic template and we were able to see the changes on the drawer component, right? We were also able to change the configurations such as width and position from the outside of the drawer component as well, right? Great. That takes us to version 3 of our drawer component implementation. So it says something about multiple content projection. So we have already learned about content projection. So this is something that the next step of content projection you can imagine, right? So we are going to learn about multiple content projections. So what is multiple content projections? Before explaining what it is, let's think about this. A scenario where you want to, let's say you want to always in the drawer component, which is the reusable component, but you always want to tell that whatever is the header of the drawer, right? Whatever comes on the header of the drawer, I need to have a background color, right? And whatever in the body, I need to have a little bit of padding, right? Only for the body, not for the header. But at this point, we don't have such a control, right? At this point, whatever we pass, it's directly taken here and replace this ng content, so to say, right? But there's no way we can pass it in sections or in slots, right? This is exactly what multiple content projection is about. So it's basically you can write another ng content, right? And select specific portion of your template that you're passing and fill this slot and select another specific slot, specific template and fill this particular slot, right? So to prove that, let me create a div and give a class called drawer head, right? And let me give drawer head class a background of heel maybe. Heel would look weird, but yeah, you get the point. And let's place another ng content inside this. And so now we have two ng content. One is inside the head, one is inside the head, and one is outside the head, right? So whatever comes inside the head should be styled because we have said, okay, I need that control at least, right, on the reusable component. And whatever comes as a body stays as a body. Now, how do we select those, right? It's so Angular provides us with an attribute called select, where I can select my head like this, and I can do the same for the body, right? So now we have selected head and body. Great. Now, how do we pass our template from here section by section, right? Now we have a class called head, but this is just a class. We are not saying anything about head or body, right? It is as simple as writing head as an attribute here and writing body as an attribute here. Let's save all of this just to make sure that this works. Let me reload. We have saved all of our changes, and just to make sure it works, let's reload and let's try to open. Great, it works. So the header now has a background color. Only the portion that you have marked as head has a background color. To prove that, let me write a lorem, some random text here, and let me refresh it again. Great. So whatever comes inside the head section, so to say, is now with a background color, right? So we have decided that so much of control we need to have on the reusable component. So there are two things you can. So the basic idea of using multiple content projection is to have control and to control the layout. So let me show you what I mean by control the layout, right? So we have passed the head first and then body. Let me actually take this from here and put it after the body. So now I'm passing body first and head second. What do you think will happen? As per the flow, the body should come on top and head should come later, right? Let me save it and let us reload. And no, it didn't. So the head still comes on top and the body comes below that. This is the controller I'm talking about. So if you have a component where you need to make sure that things are aligned well or things are layouted well, multiple content projection is the way to go, right? Great. Let me put this back. Actually, I don't want to make it look weird. Great. So another important thing to note here is that you see I have used a square bracket syntax here, right? This is basically just CSS selectors. This is nothing crazy, nothing Angularish. This is basically CSS selectors. So you select an attribute with the square bracket syntax, right? That's what we have done. Actually, you can just get rid of this square bracket syntax and use the dot syntax, which CSS selector for the class, and I can go back here and I can absolutely remove the body and head attribute because we already have head and body as a class. And if you can now go back and reload, you'll see it works just the same way. So we make use of CSS selectors to select any content that is projected from the parent component and made sure that we layouted it well. This is going to be our V3. So the version 3 was about multiple content projection. And if I can go back to my slide, let's recap the version 3 what we did. So we used multiple content projection to take control of the reusable component. By control, I have explained you what I meant by control. And we use the select keyword to grab any element using CSS selectors. Great. Okay, so we already have a pretty decent reusable component, I say. But let's not stop there, right? Let's go to V4. V4 is about export as, and this is for flexibility. Yeah, that sounds counterintuitive, right? I just talked about control and now I'm talking about flexibility, right? Because we need both. I'll explain. Coming back to the code, one downside of our code at this point, if you ask me, I say, is the fact that we have this rigid button on the drawer, which is used to close the drawer, right? But what if I want to have a differently styled button for my other use case, which is the settings use case, right? For the settings use case, what if I want to have another icon? And maybe one other place, what if I want to use maybe an anchor tag, not the button, right? But at this point, this is pretty rigid. There's nothing we cannot really pass the button, the close button. We don't have the close functionality from outside, basically, right? We have the close functionality from outside, how you can just make is open false, but we cannot give the button to the drawer which closes with a different style, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete this, right? I'm going to save it. So I deleted the button and I saved it, and let's see how this looks. So it's the same component, but without the close button. Now, how do I close this? There's no way I can close this. Great. Okay, this is where export as comes into picture. This is one of the applications of export as, I should say, right? So so in the component decorator metadata, so we already have metadata like selector and template URL and style URLs. There is an other property called export as, and I'm going to equate this to drawer. Anything you like, anything that you like to call this component, I'm going to call this drawer. Basically, what this one single line is doing is exposing your public methods and properties of this component to the outside, right? Otherwise, how would you do that? You would use view child and then grab the element and then call the public methods and all that, right? But instead of that, this particular magic string is going to represent our component in the parent component, right? How are we going to use this? So we named it the drawer. Now, if I go to the common component and in app drawer, I'm going to define a template variable named, I don't know, common drawer maybe, common drawer, and equate this to drawer. Let me save it. So this drawer is this drawer, right? This is how we exposed it. So in this template at this point, common drawer represents the app drawer, all of its public methods and properties, right? So if I want to have a close method that is passed from here, like say I want to have a close button inside the head, right? What I can simply do, okay, let me make it close. Okay, and what I can simply do is when I click on this, on click, I can actually use this reference to call the close method of app drawer. So by close, I am actually referring to this method, right? So let's save this and let me close it and let me reload it. Right? So we opened and here you go. Here you have the close button that you passed from the outside, right? The beauty of this is that if you, let's say you don't want, oh, I clicked something very wrong. I don't, sorry. Okay, so the beauty of this is, let's say you wanted to have a anchor tag, right? Whenever you give an anchor, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what I'm clicking wrong. So whenever you give anchor tag as a button, let's make sure we give button as a role, right? And even at this point, you're giving an anchor tag because you want to, maybe sometime you want to have an icon at this here, right? And if I can reload, I hope it's already reloaded. You see, now this acts as a close button. Great. So let me take it back to the button. Great. So this already works. So now we have the ability to provide a close button from outside, right? So what did we do with the export as? Let's go back to the slides and do a recap. So we remove the rigid button first from the drawer component, and we used export as to expose our component, and then we used close method from the outside using the button that is provided from outside, right? Great. So that, there you go. That's our v4. That's our version 4 of our drawer component. And next, we are going to take this to CSS variables. Right. You must be thinking, you are using SCSS, and why are you talking about CSS? Hold on, let me explain this. So let's close this. Okay, I think it's stuck. Let me reopen. Yeah, let's just make sure this works. Great. So going back to the code, another thing that for me weird about this implementation, let me actually close this. Implementation is the fact that we have getter, and all the getter does is provide styles, and it just simply create a style object and sends it back. This works, obviously this works, but we are actually triggering a lot of change detections for no reason, actually, right? And this is a lot of code in the, a lot of unwanted code, so to say, right? So what I'm going to do, I am going to delete this, or maybe delete it, right? And let me go back and actually let me remove this ng style as well. I'm saving this, and now what will happen, you think? Okay, we'll have the dashboard component with the close button and nothing else, because we cannot open it because we haven't given the logic to do it, right? So how are we going to now manage open and close just by using CSS, right? That's what we are going to do in version 5. We are going to open and close just by using CSS, right? So for this, I'm going to introduce 3 classes. We are going to bind 3 classes, one being is open. So this is Angular class binding syntax. So we have is open, and another one, okay, sorry, class dot, another one, class dot position right, which applies when the drawer is actually positioned at the right, and another one which is class dot position left. We are going to fill here, but for now we have 3 classes. Is open is applied when the drawer is opened, and the right is applied when it is positioned right, and the left is applied when it is positioned left. We know how to bind this, right? Is open is actually easy as binding it to is open property, right? And position is actually easy as position, taking this with position right, right? And okay, and doing the same for position left, right? So we are going to apply 3 classes conditionally, which makes the drawer open and close. So even at this point, if you go back to the application, you'll see nothing has changed because we haven't even implemented these classes, right? Let's go back and implement those classes, right? Let's start by implementing position right. Great. So what do you want? When do you want this position right? Is when you position at the right. So what styles do you actually want to give? These are the same styles. If you remember, these are the same styles that we need in the getter. We are going to convert the same logic to CSS, right? So when it is positioned right, we want to control the right property. Before that, if you remember, we had the default style for the width, right? So let me give that first. So if you remember the sorry, if you remember the class name was drawer container. Let me grab drawer container and let me give that style, which is width, which is going to be 400 pixels, right? And yeah, don't freak out. I know I'm writing 400 pixel. Don't freak out. We'll come back to this. So now we have width given and which is static, and now we need to make sure that we give right property to this. So when the drawer is closed, the right will be minus 400 pixel, correct? And when the drawer is open, and if it has is open class, we need to make sure that the right property is 0. Does this make sense? Is it making sense? Right. This is the exact same logic that we had on the getter that we are translating to CSS, right? So exactly. So let's also implement the position left, right? Which is basically the same thing, but we are changing the left property. Correct? Let's save this and let's see if this works. So width we have given both the styles. Yeah, it should work actually. So let's reload this. Okay, let's try opening. Yeah, that works. Let's try closing. Yeah, that works as well. Great. Actually, to prove that we have those classes, let me inspect and prove it to you, just to make sure that we are not doing any magic here, right? So the drawer container has the width, which we have given, default style, and also has is open and position right. So when it is open, we have said that the right should be 0. And since it is inside the position right, the right should be 0. Correct? So if I close this, sorry, if I close this, you will see the right is now minus 400 pixel, right? It's working, correct? So now we can control opening and closing from CSS itself, right? But what happened to our width now? Everything else is working fine, but width is static, right? Actually, to do that, we can take help of CSS variables. This is where the CSS variables are coming into picture. Let me actually define a CSS variable in the host selector. Let me name it, here we go, drawer width. And by default, it's going to be 400 pixels. Yeah. And let me replace this. Actually, okay. Let me replace this 400 pixel with the variable width over here and here and here, right? Except that we need to multiply this with -1. How can we do that? We can use the calc function, CSS calc function, to do that. So we can do -1 multiplied by the drawer width. Great. And actually we can do the same thing for the left as well. So now we are using CSS variables. I know we are hard coding the width. We'll change this, but we are at least using CSS variables to control the width, right? So I hope this is reloaded. If not, let me reload. Comments. It works the same way, right? Now our only mission is to make sure that we can override this width property from the parent, right? And it's quite simple. You don't, I know you don't trust me. It's quite simple. I'll go back to the common component where we are passing all these inputs, and I am going to style bind it. Style dot CSS variable is equal to 200 actually pixels is equal to 200 pixels. Hold on, let me save this. If this works, right? So now the width should be smaller, should be 200 pixels. Let me open. Great, width is actually smaller. You can inspect and see if it is 200 pixels, right? Great. So how could we do this? And where is this documented? This is one of those Angular topic that is least documented, and maybe they thought we don't have to document this because it is end of the day it is style binding, and Angular team has assumed that you would use CSS variables also in style binding. Maybe that is the reason it was never anywhere documented. But now that you know you can do this, you can make use of this in a lot of places. But make sure you don't overuse this because it will make your template looks weird if you overuse it, right? So this is our V5. We have used CSS variables to control, and actually, in fact, we can now go back and delete our width input, right? Because we are never using it. We don't want it because we are now controlling the width through CSS variables. Great. So this is going to be the V5 of our drawer component. We have done all of this. Let's forget it. Let's recap what we did in V5. So we removed the getter for styling, and we used CSS variables. We actually used style binding to bind CSS variables of the drawer component to control the width of the drawer, right? Great. Now we are going to the V6, the version 6 of our drawer component. Actually, I am not going to explain, like I said, I will not be explaining, I will not be coding, like coding the V6 because I accepted that from the top for the reason that it's going to take more time. So I'll just give you how we can, I'll just give you an idea of how we can do, and we'll point you to one of the articles that I've written. Right. So V6 is all about lazy loading. You might have already heard about lazy loading, right? You know we can lazy load the modules in Angular. If you haven't heard of lazy loading, let me explain. Let's say you have an application with home component and about component, or home route and about route, and when you want to make sure that the home, when you land on the home component, that only the home module is loaded and not the about module, because you don't want it. So lazy loading is the technique of loading a certain piece of data when you need it, not in advance, but lazily. The opposite is called eager loading. Eager loading is basically you loading everything to the browser when you actually start the application, or you load all of the data when you actually start something, right? So that's about the module lazy loading, right? But here we are talking about the component lazy loading. Actually, we'll be doing content lazy loading, not the component lazy loading. For example, let's go back to our component and see. At this point, what we have is list of comments. Let's say to the article, right? Let's say this is coming from let's say this is coming from an API response, right? And at this point, if you are going to make that data inside the common component, right? What going to happen is, even though you don't want that particular API call to be made when the page is loaded, but instead you only want it to happen when you open the drawer, because you don't actually care if the comments are there or not when the page is loaded. You only care if the comments are there when the drawer is loaded, right? But at this point of our application, if you had an API request over here, it would actually load before hand, even when you start the application. This is where you might want to use lazy loading, just to make sure that the unwanted content or off-screen content loads in a lazy manner, on demand, whenever you want it, right? So actually, I have written an article. I can actually point to you this. I've written an article about this, why and how to lazy load components in Angular, taking an example of an accordion component. So you can translate the same accordion logic to the drawer. It should work exactly the same way. So what we basically do is we will not render the template until we open the component, right? That's what we basically do. And you can go to this article if you want to have a look at this. This is the article I'm talking about. And that's going to be our V6, and that's going to be all, right? The time is, oh, okay, I do exactly 1 hour, I guess. almost 1 hour. So this is going to be all. So let's recap everything that we did, right? So we have created a simple version 1 basic drawer component. We extracted the drawer component into a separate reusable component and used it, made it better version by version. And at the last, we implemented the lazy, we haven't implemented, but implementing the lazy loading to make our application perform better. Right? Great. So any of you, if you are looking for code of this session, can find it GitHub/Bharath Ravi 27/ng-Keralam demo. You will find version by version code, and you will also find the master code with all of the changes. Right? And thank you. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for being here. And I would also like to thank the organizers of ng-Keralam, Suhas and Sundaram. In fact, this is my first ever tech talk that I'm doing. This is my first ever online or offline talk that I'm doing. And I'm so grateful for ng-Keralam giving me this opportunity to do this. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you feel like following me, feel free to follow me on Twitter. If you feel like reading my articles, please go to Medium and read my articles. And if you have any questions outside this, please feel free to mail bharathravi27@gmail.com. And that's all about it. Thank you. Over to you, Sundar.
Yeah. Yeah, I think thanks, Bharat. I think that was an awesome session, like developing the component from scratch and going to V6. It was a very good session. So thanks for that. It was not like your first talk actually. It was well prepared
Thank you
and
so much. Thanks a lot.
well
It
delivered.
means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. So guys, if you have any questions regarding this session, you can post it in the comments or you can reach out to him on Twitter. He will be happy to reply. Yeah. Thanks, Bharat. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, so next we have Jay. He'll be talking about how to build real-time Angular apps with NgRx and Websockets. So over to you, Jay. You're on mute.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, now it's
Okay,
audible.
I'll share my screen
Sure.
and we'll get going. Okay, can we see my screen?
Yeah, yes, Jay.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about using NgRx data, WebSockets, and Nest to build a real-time application. So who am I? I'm the co-founder and CTO of Charleston.org. We're a social enterprise and an all-in-one fundraising platform for charities and nonprofits. I'm an open source contributor. Some of my favorite projects I've contributed to are Nest, NX, and NgRx. I authored a book about Nest.js, and I'm working on another one right now for building production level code bases from the ground up with NX. And I'm a big fan of beards. As you can see, there's varying lengths of beards over the years. So what is NgRx? A lot of people get confused with NgRx because they think NgRx itself is a state management solution, which isn't fully correct. NgRx is a collection of reactive libraries for Angular. NgRx Store is NgRx's state management solution. So they have there's other things in the NgRx ecosystem that are not state related necessarily. They have a new, let's say, like a component library for NgRx push, which is just a new async pipe. They have NgRx let, which is like ng-if, but it doesn't actually remove the template if it gets a falsy value. It just unwraps observables. Anyway, just other things that you can look at. Today, we'll be taking a look into NgRx data and by extension, store and effects. So the NgRx state management lifecycle, I pulled this directly from the website just so we can go over how the lifecycle of the store works because some people might not be familiar with it. So what happens here is we have all of our data stored in the store. You can select the data, so query or pull the data from the store using selectors. Components would then use the selectors to display the data from store in the component. The component would dispatch actions, and an action is like it tells the store to do something. The reducer would take that action and modify the store in some way, and then update the store with that new value. Actions can also trigger effects, and effects are what they're called side effects. This is where you do, API calls, other things that require injected services. Reducers aren't classes. They're not injected, so they don't have dependency injection available or constructors. They're just functions essentially. So if you want to do anything like, opening success failure snack bars, API requests, anything like that, you would use an effect. And then from that effect, you would then dispatch another action to update the store. So that's how the NgRx store state management lifecycle works. What we're going to be talking about today is NgRx data, though. And what data does is it abstracts NgRx store and NgRx effects. So this is I built this because they don't have one for NgRx data, so it's not quite as pretty as the other one is, unfortunately. But what we have here is, with NgRx data, instead of defining these actions and reducers and selectors and all of this other stuff, what you do is you define entity metadata. And what the entity metadata is it describes the shape of the store that you're building. So, the only required property on it is the name of the entity, but you can supply other things like the filter function, a compare function, stuff like that. So with that, you then define an entity data service. This is an injectable service that you can use with DI, and it would give you everything you need for your entity. It gives you all of your functions for, CRUD related operations, getting, updating, deleting, creating, etc. That is the service that the component would use. So instead of dispatching actions or, selecting data from the store, the component just uses the entity data service and has all the functions available to it. The entity data service is also responsible for doing all of the effects that you would have seen here. And it will, make all the API calls for you and everything like that. So it's quite a bit of a simpler mental model here. So what we have here is what it would be if we were using store and effects to define an entity. So we have an entity, story. It doesn't, just an example here. Our story state, it's a list of stories. There's a loading string, there's an error response, just a classic NgRx story. You can add whatever other properties you want to this. We have 3 actions here: get story success, get story failure. And then we also have our reducer: get story success, and get story failed. So this is all the code that's required for NgRx for just story and just the actions and reducers for getting a story. This doesn't give you anything to do with creating, deleting, updating, querying beyond just getting by the ID, anything like that. It also doesn't include any of the effects. So as you start to get to 10s, 20s, 30s, hundreds of entities in your application, this becomes unbelievably unmaintainable, right? There's so much code to deal with. With NgRx data, this is all you have to do. This gets us the same thing as what we just saw, but it gives us add, delete, get all, get by ID, get with query, update, all of the reducers for all those actions, all of the selectors, and then all of the effects and API services. This is it. So as you can see, we have this story entity metadata, right? Entity names, our story. This is our entity data service. It extends the entity collection service base, which is just a class that defines all of these different functions, as well as the selectors that you can. There's some pre-built selectors for filtered entities, the entity map, just a list of all of the entities in the store. And then you can build selectors on top of those if you want. So how does this work? One of my favorite things about NgRx data is that you can subscribe to these functions that you're calling. So normally when you work with NgRx and you dispatch an action, that dispatch returns void. You can't subscribe to the result of that action. You can't, respond to it. It all needs to be done with an effect and asynchronously, right? With NgRx data, when I call add entity, I can subscribe to that. And that subscription will fire and complete when that entity gets back from the API, which is really awesome. But how does this work? Because in the background, NgRx data is just using the dispatch method. It's just dispatching actions. It's just firing effects and reducers and all this kind of stuff. So this is a little bit of code that I pulled out from the NgRx repo. What it does here is it creates a correlation ID. We'll get into that more in a second. It creates the action. It doesn't use the action creator or anything because NgRx doesn't actually care if you use the creator function. It just expects it in a certain form. And then it dispatches the action, returns a stream of all of the actions in the application, but filters for the correlation ID so it knows that it's getting the right action. First is there just to make sure that we don't have a continuous stream that never completes. And then we map the data so that when we call add, what's fired in the subscription is the data from the success or the failure, but the failure would trigger a throw error anyway. So this allows us to, in our components, say, story data service .add .subscribe, and then take in the story, and then redirect somewhere or route somewhere or pop up a snack bar and say story was successfully created, stuff like that. So that's how you can subscribe to it. So what's happening here is the component would call the function. The data service then dispatches the action, which would trigger an effect, which you didn't write, right? That's all internal. The effect would make the HTTP call. The API would return to the effect. The effect would then dispatch the success or failure action back to the store. And then the data service would fire its subscription and complete. So we're going to take a quick look at this. We haven't gotten into the WebSocket stuff quite yet, but we will after we take a look at how NgRx data is working. Okay, so what we have here is we have these two screens. It's just a basic Kanban board, Trello board, whatever you want to call it, right? You can add new stories, you can update them, et cetera, et cetera. So we're technically viewing the same page here, but we don't have WebSockets enabled. So when we go to add a story, it only adds on the one. But if we refresh, it's there, right? So these are pulling from the same data source. But if we make changes, then we're not seeing those updates, right? So that's because we're using HTTP as our transport mechanism instead of WebSockets. So let's take a look at these actions that are dispatched here for a second. Remember that correlation ID that we were talking about? Well, what we're looking at right now is the Redux Dev Tools. If you've never used it and you use NgRx, I highly suggest that you go download the store dev tools because they're unbelievably helpful. You can see all of the different actions that are dispatched. You can see the state at the time of that action. You can see the difference in the state, i.e. how the reducer changed the state, etc. So what we're looking at here is NgRx data save add one. This is the initial action that's dispatched when the component, i.e. when we click this add new button, this is the action that gets dispatched. Our payload, so there's just some basic data. We're adding it to the 0th index of the column in the first column. Description, just default data. But we have this correlation ID here. What this is for is this will be maintained through the whole NgRx data action lifecycle, if you want to call it that, so that when we get the success back, this is the action that the effect would have dispatched when the API returned. It has the same correlation ID. And that is how we were able to complete that stream of all actions and return an observable and subscribe to our CRUD methods. So if we go to the next one, we can see that the correlation ID is different. So this will just increment every time we make a new call, whether it be an update, delete, read, whatever it is. NgRx data just needs to know that what successes and failures are tied to what actions so they can complete that subscription stream. So that's NgRx data and WebSockets with just, that's NgRx data without WebSockets. That's just using the default HTTP transport mechanism, right? So we're going to add in some real-time functionality now. So I created 3 libraries for this, the client, the core, and the server. What these do are, the client is obviously the client-side code, right? It's for Angular and NgRx. It just provides some classes you can extend from and other things like that. Core has the typings in it that both client and server use because some people might not be using a TypeScript server. Some people might not be using Nest.js. So they're not going to be using the WebSocket server package. And then WebSocket server, what that gives you is essentially just an interface that your Nest gateways, which are the gateways for your WebSockets, to implement, so you know that you're receiving and returning the correct data so that NgRx data is able to process the actions correctly. So how easy is the Angular code change, right? Because you're thinking, oh, WebSockets, they can be complicated. You don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. So on the left, what we have is our plain NgRx data service. This is what we had before, what we were just viewing. What we have on the right is the code for implementing sockets. So instead of extending entity collection service base, which provides all the CRUD selectors, etc., we extend socket collection service base. This is going to give us all of the same functionality. You can add, you can delete, you can update, you can get all of that kind of stuff. That is it for the client-side code. Now our data service is using WebSockets instead of HTTP as its transport mechanism. Obviously, your backend still needs to support WebSockets for this to work, but client-side, this is the only change. So let's take a quick look at it in action before we dive into how it actually works. So I have these two new tabs here. These are the WebSocket pages. So these are using the WebSocket transport mechanism rather than the HTTP mechanism. So you can see that when I added a card on the left, the right displayed the card as well. And this is because they're connected to the same socket. So they know. So both clients know that when a change is made, it gets that change from the server and then reduces that change into the its own store, right? So what's happening here is we have the same action. We have our NgRx data save add one. We had this before as well. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to go back here. Oh, I skipped over this slide. Weird. Okay, here's the slide I was looking for. So what's happening here is because WebSockets don't have this correlation request response architecture, right? Like you don't make a request to a WebSocket and then necessarily get a response back, right? They're all asynchronous. So what happens here is we still have this component calls the data service, and then the data service calls the effect, but there's this extra step in there where we leverage the same correlation ID process as normal NgRx data does and do a second correlation ID. So the effect dispatches a WebSocket with a correlation ID. The API will handle it and then return a new socket event, which is essentially going to contain the action data in it, right, to all of the clients. And then our calling client is going to see that correlation ID and think, sweet, well, I know about this correlation ID. This was the dispatching event. Well, here's our success event, and that is able to complete the stream. So we're able to call .add.subscribe and get our data back that was request responsed from WebSockets. So now the demo and code review, but we already did it. So we'll just go take a look at the actions. Just clear this quickly. Okay, so let's add a new story. So we can see they're both there, right? So we have this NgRx data save one action. The action looks identical as it did before. We have our operation, our entity name, the data, and then our correlation ID. So CRID5, right? Hasn't changed. We then have our NgRx data WebSocket save add one. Now this is the action that's dispatched internally by the WebSocket mechanism that has a different correlation ID. This is that secondary correlation ID, right? Because this is the action that actually dispatched the WebSocket event, the WebSocket event to the server. The server does some processing, right, which is essentially added to a database, and then returns a new socket event to all clients. That socket event is parsed out and then dispatched to the store. So we get an NgRx data WebSocket save add one success. It has the same correlation ID, CRID6, as this one, right? So it's able to complete the stream. We then parse this event into what NgRx data is expecting for the internal data implementation, which is the NgRx data save add one success. And then that would then reduce those changes into the store. So this first one and this fourth one haven't changed. Those are still NgRx data. It's operating how it always has operated. We just have this intermediary step right here, which is handling the WebSocket request response architecture the same way that NgRx data handles the action dispatch success failure dispatch architecture. So that's for the calling client. So now what does it look like on the receiving clients? So receiving clients, they're only going to get 2 of the actions in the store, right? They didn't trigger anything, so they're not going to get the save add one or the WebSocket save add one. What they do get though is the add one success, because the socket, i.e. the server, told them we successfully added a WebSocket, or we successfully added an entity, so you need to reduce this into your store. We have the payload and the type. That's all it needs. It doesn't need to know about the correlation ID because it never triggered anything, right? This would then get parsed out and into the NgRx data save add one success, which NgRx data would then take and run with. It would then take that action. It would reduce the data into the store. The selectors would fire, and the view is updated, right? So let's do that a bit more. Updates, right? So that's how the WebSockets work with NgRx data. But let's take a quick look at the code to see what the gateway is actually doing, right? You've seen essentially all of the client code. The client code is just switching the extends method, but in the gateway code, what do we have here? So if you've never used Nest.js, this is what a Nest.js gateway looks like. This is what defines the socket messages, how to process them, what to emit, all of that kind of stuff. So we have this socket entity gateway base. This is similar to the socket and socket collection service base, I think it's called, from the client side, which just tells us the story gateway that here's the methods you need to implement, here's their request types, and here's their response types, so that your clients are able to send data in the correct form, but as well as receive data in the correct form. So I'll take a quick look at a simple one. We have query all. This is essentially just a get all method, right? So when the application loads up, if you want, you can just give me all the stories, right? This is just a decorator that Nest.js uses to tell Nest, execute this method when this socket event comes in. You're subscribed to these socket events. We have our actual function signature. Our body is going to be a socket event body. So this is enforced by the socket entity gateway base, right? Because this knows that the first parameter of the query all method is going to be the body. Now it's just querying all. There's no actual parameters. There's no request data or anything. So the body of this is actually just void. But it needs to know about the event body because there's that correlation ID in there, right? Just because we're not sending any data for the query doesn't mean we don't need to know about the correlation ID, because NgRx data still needs to, or by internal implementation anyway, still needs to know about the correlation ID so that it can complete that observable stream. Then we just have the connected socket. In this method, we don't actually need that, but it's there because it's enforced by the interface. So what we're doing here is we're just returning the new event. This is the success socket event, which would then be reduced into the store. This is enforced by the return type of socket event return of this socket event. And then here's the socket body data, essentially. It's just an array of stories, right? So we're just going to, do story model.find, whatever. That implementation is completely irrelevant to this demo. You can store your data however you want. This does not assume anything about your data access layer. It's just the receiving the socket events, and dispatching the socket events. So we need to make sure that we have the correlation ID and then that our event type is correct. So this return type is going to enforce that this is here, and this is here. So that's a simple one. Let's go to the update one. So there's a couple other things happening in the update, right? Because when one client updates a story, all of the connected clients need to also update that story. So we need to not only return that socket event to the calling client, but we need to dispatch it to everybody else. So again, we have the socket event body, right? This time though, we have a socket update request payload, which just says, we're going to update this story and enforces some more typings. Our return is the socket event return again, right? Same thing as we had before. And then a socket update response payload. So again, this is just going to, has the ID, the changes, so what is being changed in the update, and then whether it's changed or not. These are built off of what NgRx data is expecting internally because it needs that information to reduce the data into the store correctly. That's not an implementation of these libraries. That's an NgRx data thing. So the event comes in, we update it. Again, data access layer, doesn't matter. You can use whatever you want. Then we're going to take our calling client and tell all the other clients that are connected to the stories room that there's a story updated. So, hey, all other clients, we're updating one story, or we successfully updated one story, right? Our data is going to be the ID, which is the primary key. Here, story has a primary key of ID, but yours might have story ID as the primary key. That doesn't matter. Changes, what was actually updated. So this can be a partial if you want it to, or it can just be the full model. It's up to you. And then if it was changed or not. Here it's set to false. Don't worry about that. It's not super relevant to this demo. If you want to read more about that, that's in the NgRx documentation, I think. So what this is actually doing here is, because we're using the client to emit, it doesn't emit back to itself. It's just the client telling all the other clients in the same room that something happened. So we still need to return this one with the correlation ID, which is inside the body, so that the calling client is able to complete that observable stream, right? So then we can, trigger the effect, reduce the data in, and then if the component subscribed to that CRUD method, we're able to get the response and respond to it, route, display a message, update the template, whatever it might be. So that's a more complex one. From there, they're all pretty similar. Add one, you create, and then you emit, and then you return. Those are all pretty similar from here on out. Yeah, so that is how you connect NgRx data to WebSockets to build real-time applications. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, there's the GitHub repo. So this demo that we just viewed is at this link right there. You're more than welcome to tweet at me if you have questions about it. All the packages that we talked about here, the core client and server, are listed at that NPM link. And then I started blogging at this link. So I only have a couple up there right now, but I hope to talk more about it soon, especially this kind of stuff. So something to note, as of this writing, I think Nest is on V7 or it's V6, I can't remember. But they're still using Socket.io v2, which doesn't have the best TypeScript typings, unfortunately. So once Nest updates to Socket.io v3 or v4, which I believe is coming in Nest 8, I will update the repo for Socket.io v4, which was rewritten in TypeScript. So it has awesome typings to it. So there is some any's. You're not going to get some necessarily super helpful type hints in a couple of places just because the Socket.io v2 types aren't amazing, unfortunately. So yeah, that is it. I would be more than happy to take questions because I know there's a lot there to digest.
Okay, so till now there are no questions. Say maybe we can wait for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, no problem.
Yep.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, just type them in the chat or whatever. I'd be more than happy to talk about them, or reach out to me later if you want to.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've not had questions. I must be getting better at it.
Okay, I think there are no
Huh?
questions today. So if you have
Okay.
any questions, yeah, you can reach out to him in his Twitter. Like this is Twitter handle. This crawler, you can see
Mhm.
J Cooper Bell. Like you can reach out to him if you have any questions. And yeah, once again, thanks, Jay. I think it's I know it's early morning there, so thanks for showing interest towards speaking to our community. Thanks for that.
No problem. I'm probably gonna go back to bed after this. It's
Okay,
only
okay.
6 a.m. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. It was awesome talking to you all. Thanks to us for organizing this and reaching out to me, getting this all set up.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Thanks for your time.
No problem.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, so I think the two talks, I liked it very much because it was more of a demo, and the two talks I liked it very much. So thanks once again to Jay and Bharat. Keep talking. You two are a great speaker. So thanks for the support. And I think we came to the end of the event. So this is our meetup group. You can go to this link, meetup.com/talkify community. You can just go to this link, and there'll be a button here like join meetup. You can just join our group to get updates of our future events. Like as Sundara mentioned earlier, we also do events Microsoft in Microsoft technologies as well as Angular. You can click join, and if we create any events, you'll be notified via email, and there'll be no spam email. So whenever we create event, you'll be notified. We already have 425 members in this meetup group, so you can just go to this link and click join. And yeah, I think thanks everyone. So thanks for the speakers and attendees. Thanks for your time. Thanks for joining on this Saturday and spending some time with us. So thanks for that. And yeah, so it's very hard time out there. So stay safe, guys. So stay at home. And yeah, we'll meet next month. So thank you.